All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that Clause 1 and 2 stand part. The question is that Clause 1 stand part. I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's great sadness that I rise after my SOPs have been defeated, but we now come to the point where we're able to summary debate, in a sense, around the Vulnerable Children Bill and whether or not it's appropriately titled through the fact that it is indeed called the Vulnerable Children's Bill. I think my colleague Porter Williams really summed up some of the issues around the problematic nature of trying to partition off who is vulnerable and who isn't when you're referring to children. And it was a really significant debate amongst the children's workforce and the children's sector when the first Green Paper went out. And I think in particular she's raised an important point around family violence. And the fact that technically, if you're taking a definition of vulnerable children in the way that SIPS currently behaves, being exposed to family violence isn't by default what they tend to be treating as a vulnerability. The fact that you're not automatically brought in within child, youth and families' remit of work by simply witnessing family violence, I don't think is because the evidence doesn't stack up for that. Quite to the contrary, the evidence absolutely does. But simply the scale of cases faced by child, youth and family, I think, means that they're unable to do so. That needs to change. That absolutely needs to change. I became even more convinced of that after some time ago now. I read every coroner's report in the past few years that involved the death of a child in child, youth and families care. Everyone. And the thing that struck me the most wasn't the similarities between the cases or how devastating each and every one of them were, but the number of cases where children and young people had harmed themselves. And it wasn't necessarily because they had been subjected to direct child abuse or because they had had violence against them, but in every single one of those cases where that child or young person had harmed themselves, there had been significant family violence in their home. Significant family violence. And there's one case in particular that still stays in my mind, and it reminded me of how important it is that we recognise the impact that family violence has on a child and the vulnerability that flows from that, and the fact that there is no default support or counselling even for those children is a significant issue, let alone the fact that there is no default position that child, youth and family take heed of when children are exposed. And even we heard from the Children's Commissioner some time ago that there was a move to try and move away from the default of police referring family violence cases for referral to child, youth and family because they were simply being overwhelmed with cases. We must be mindful of the impact that family violence has on vulnerability. And when you use the word vulnerable children as well, and again I refer to whether or not this is an appropriate title for this bill, this actually should be about vulnerable children and young people. And as my colleague Sue Moroney has said, we had sought and still will continue to seek for the SIFS Act to take into its auspices 18-year-olds. It should not, the care of the state should not cut out at the time that a child turns 17. That point was made so strongly by the Dingwall Trust in the magnificent submission from a young person there. But on behalf of young people, there was another in the written submission from Robin, who's 20 years old. She said the average age of leaving parental care in New Zealand is 23. So why does the care system relinquish all responsibility for us when legally we are not deemed adults? Why are we taken out of care when we cannot legally sign for papers such as tenancy, housing bill payments, let alone vote? We don't need the added stress. Picture your average teenager dealing with emotional, hormonal or physical changes to the body, with the added strain from school, exams, peer pressure, all the while trying to fit in and develop their own identities. The difference between this teenager and a teen in care is that at age 17, your average teen is not expected to do this on their own. At 17, your average teen has emotional support from family. We do not. Financial support from family. We do not. Has a place to fall back on? We do not. We're alone. We are alone. And I think that completely summarises what needs to change in the care and protection system for those young people. Now, yes, the Minister has put in provisions where advice and support, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Member, Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you. Where the provisions where, and particularly in Part 3, where if a young person is referred to the Chief Executive who is over the age of 17, the Chief in need of additional support, the Chief Executive, and I quote, must provide or arrange the provision of such advice and non-financial assistance as the Chief Executive in his or her discretion considers necessary to enable the person to achieve independence. So still, around the notion of vulnerability, we have a high level of discretion. And that's where it becomes problematic, Mr Chair. And so we wanted to take out some of that discretion. We wanted some of those mays to become musts, particularly when it talked about financial assistance, because the Chief Executive currently in this bill is able to make a judgment, may provide or the provision of financial assistance within their discretion. There was also no obligation for them to provide for housing, and that's probably the biggest gap that we have. This bill applies presumably to vulnerable children, but also young people, because guardianship orders, for instance, special guardianship orders, can apply to an 18-year-old, and yet the additional arrangements under the SIFS Act only apply to 17-year-olds. So already we have a bit of a gap there. But when we're talking about vulnerability of children, we are putting children out of state care at 17 without having adequate housing arrangements for that small little gap of young people. Because if you're 18, Housing New Zealand can suddenly take an interest in you. If you're 17, they won't. And I've seen examples of that. I visited a youth services provider once and heard the story of a young person who'd gone to them for housing help. They were no longer under SIFS care. The only place they could refer them was Women's Refuge. That was the only place they were able to find shelter for that young person. So we have an absolute gap that would be fixed by simply moving the obligation of child, youth and family to continue to have a responsibility to a child that has been put under the care of the state until they turn 18. Now, granted, the Minister in this bill has said, look, up until 20, we want to make some options available for their transition to independence. But there's just a bit too much discretion around that. It is very much an optional thing. And sure, some young people won't want to continue to be in residential care, but let's keep the option open for them. And let's put the onus on the state to provide it if that is what they seek. Additionally, Mr Chair, you can see then why it's fraught. The Vulnerable Children's Bill perhaps should be the Vulnerable Children and Young Persons Bill. That's what it should have covered. Perhaps, though, our wider point all the way through this bill has been that actually the word vulnerable is fraught. If we want to lift the well-being of vulnerable children, we should actually be focusing on the well-being of every child. That if we put in place provisions that have an element of universalism, and then we overlay that with additional targeted support for those who need it most, then we're more likely to have beneficial outcomes for a wider range of children. Now, yes, of course, there are going to be families and children who are at the most hard end of neglect and abuse and offending that need the direct, immediate attention of the state. And none of what we have said around lifting the well-being of all children tries to dilute that, not at all. But as I made the point in yesterday, Mr. Chair, that we have tried too hard in this bill, or the government has, to try and separate out social issues that can't be separated out. They've tried to say that abuse sits here, that neglect sits here, and other issues like domestic and family violence sit over here. You barely get a mention of it in some of the work that we've seen off the back of this action plan. Domestic and family violence sits here. Material deprivation and poverty sits way over here. In fact, let's dump a whole lot of personal responsibility mantra over the top of that. That they've tried to compartmentalise and petition it, and Mr Chair, you simply cannot do that when it comes to children.
Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Minister. Paula, Ben.
Mr Chair, I stand up at this part with the title of the Vulnerable Children's Bill and